podcast on the First Barons' War and the Magna Carta. Now you could get a question on either of these, so it's important you listen really carefully to this and pick up the things about the First Barons' War but also about the Magna Carta. So here goes. So the first thing you need to think about for the First Barons' War is why did it all happen? And the answer is really King John. So King John was not a popular king, partly because his brother King Richard had been a really popular king, and in comparison people felt a little bit disappointed with King John. So what did he do wrong then? Well, one of the first things that he did wrong is he constantly charged the barons a tax called scutage. So what that meant is you had to actually pay not to fight for the king, and then he would use that money to pay mercenaries, which is foreign troops, to fight for him. So he increased that price over really 11 times in a row. So what ended up happening was the barons got completely sick and tired of having to pay more and more money in terms of the scutage tax. So that didn't go down well. He also lost Normandy. So he lost Normandy in France right near the start of his reign, and he tried for the next 10 years to try and win it back. Now, he was mocked by the barons because he kept not being able to do that. So they called him Soft Sword and Lackland. And obviously he knew they were calling him this, but he was frustrated about not being able to get, Normandy back, because that was, a big thing. He felt embarrassed that he'd lost that. So what else happened? Well, the king was used to being in charge, because with the feudal system, the king was always at the top, then it was the barons, then it was the knights, then it was the peasants. So it was a surprise to him when the barons started to try and sort of flex their muscles and their power and, didn't want to do everything that the king wanted. And he had a bit of a falling out with the Pope, and this led to an excommunication of King John. And also King John wasn't happy that the Pope thought he could appoint an archbishop in England. So he appointed the Archbishop Langdon, and he was like, how come you can decide to do that? It should be the King of England's job to appoint, the people in the church. And something else that also really annoyed the barons was they used to get charged ridiculous amounts of money to inherit the father's lands. So it could be £7,000, it could be £40,000, and really they were inheriting their own father's lands, which was annoying for them. And also he charged them for making peace with him. So again, it could be £40,000, that these people were being charged to make peace with him. So he was making a lot of money from doing things really in quite a corrupt way. So it'd be no surprise that the barons had just had enough, and they started to circulate a charter that they might make, King John sign, because they felt he needed to be, reined in, and he should be told what to do by them. So in June in 1215 at Runnymede, the two armies met. So the barons' army met the king's army. And what ended up happening in terms of that is King John looked outside his tent and realised that there was no way he was going to be able to defeat the barons. Not a chance. So what he decided to do he decided, right, okay, I need to sort of buy myself some time here. So the barons made him sign the Magna Carta. And the Archbishop had also been instrumental in writing the Magna Carta with them. So the 63 grievances on the Magna Carta, which basically means the Great Charter. And here are some of them. You'll only need a few. So one of them, it was £100 to inherit your father's lands. Another one, everyone should be allowed, free and proper trials. Another one was no scutage should be charged unless it was with consent. And that would be unlikely because people obviously, hated that. And another thing that was really important was that 25 barons would decide on, what the king was allowed to do. So if you like, they sort of were checking on him, and the king had to obviously put the things he wanted through these 25 barons. So now the barons were in control. They could control the king. And obviously King John would absolutely hate this. But he had no choice but to sign because he knew he would lose if he fought them that day. So King John saw the Magna Carta really as a way of buying time. He had absolutely no intention of following these things, no intention whatsoever. So what he did is King John signed it, okay, promised that he would do all the things on there, and then obviously you'll see later in this podcast he doesn't do any of those things whatsoever. So why was the Magna Carta significant? Well, it was really significant because this is the first time in history where the barons were actually in charge of what the king could do. So that shifted the power in England like it had never been shifted before. So it was a move away from the old feudal system. Another reason why it was significant is that what it allowed people to see was that actually other people in England, apart from the king, might have a say in things that would happen in the country. So for example, these 25 barons could help the king decide on things, which was different to how it had ever been before. The problem with the Magna Carta though was it did alter lives for people like the barons and things like that and gave them more power, but for the normal everyday people, the peasants, it didn't affect their lives at all. It didn't go anywhere to helping them. It did later on when some of the peasants became free, but to start with it was all about the people who were, you know, higher up, like the barons and the knights and people. Another reason why the Magna Carta is significant is lots of things in terms of courts of law are based on the Magna Carta, and actually the American Declaration of Independence is based on the Magna Carta as well, that happens, you know, to start off the American Revolution in 1776. Also, the Human Declaration of Civil Rights and Human Rights is based on that, so that's obviously significant, takes parts out of that. And a lot of documentation, even like, you know, things that have been signed in Mexico, you know, for their rights and things, all of those things are based on the Magna Carta. So it is a very significant document that was signed in 1215. So then what happens after this then? So the following year, when King John, no surprise, does not follow any of the terms of the Magna Carta, the barons had had enough. So the First Barons' War begins. Now, to start with, the barons take Rochester Castle, so it looks like they're doing really well. But then King John lays siege to that and gets it back. So it looks like King John has turned the tables and, you know, he's going to have a victory here. But then absolute nightmare for King John, because the barons get the French king involved. And once the French king becomes involved, it makes it impossible for King John really. So the French king and the barons start taking over loads of bits of land in England. And unfortunately for King John, he happens to die in 1216, and really the reason for his death is, all the chroniclers say, he died from eating too many peaches. So he dies of natural causes. He doesn't die in battle or anything, but he can obviously not try and win his lands back. So the agreement was really is the French king would like to become King of England. But the barons, after the First Barons' War, bottle out of this, and instead they don't let him become king, but they get Henry III, who is the 9-year-old son of King John, on the throne, on the premise that he signs the Magna Carta. Well, of course, at 9 years old, he does sign the Magna Carta. He wouldn't really understand it, and that means he then becomes the next King of England. So that is what happens with the First Barons' War and the Magna Carta.